Okay, so this section is our domestic violence 101 section. So we're just going to go over some basics of what that means, what domestic violence is, um, laws associated with it, and things like cycle of violence and what different types of abuse are and things like that. So we will go ahead and just jump right in. So let's just sort of talk about some prevalence of domestic violence in Colorado specifically. So you can see the stat that's on the slide there of how often someone is a victim of intimate partner violence. Which, just sort of as a quick aside, we'll use the terms domestic violence and intimate partner violence interchangeably. Um, they generally mean the same thing. Intimate partner violence is a newer term because it's more specific than just domestic violence could theoretically apply to other family relationship violence. But we are talking about specifically what happens between intimate partners. But intimate partner violence, also, abbreviation IPV and domestic violence may be used interchangeably, and we mean the same thing for the purposes of this training. So anyway, going back to prevalence statistics. In 2014, 25 Coloradans were killed by former or current intimate partners. Of those 25, 23 were female victims and 22 took place in the home. So that's there were 150 homicides total that year, so that's 1 in every 6 were domestic violence related. 68% of the victims were killed with guns, which is 17 out of the 25, and then 3 were killed with knives. In 2015, all of the domestic violence crisis centers in the state of Colorado responded to more than 59,000 phone calls and served almost 19,600 clients. Those centers provided more than 91,000 nights of shelter to more than 4,000 clients. And yet we also turned away more than 12,000 individuals due to a lack of capacity in shelters. In 2014, there were 16,700 reports of domestic violence victims throughout the state. And so that's a sort of gives you an idea of how common this is in the state of Colorado. In Project Hope's service area in 2017, we served 76 primary victims of domestic violence and 45 secondary victims of domestic violence. So that's primary is the person who was abused, and secondary victims are those who maybe witness the abuse or know the abused person. So that's often, friends or other family members and that kind of thing who are not directly abused but know the person who was. So the definition of domestic violence is an act or threatened act of violence. It requires there to be an intimate relationship involved. So that either needs to be someone who's currently dating or married with someone, or it can be a couple who shares a child, even if they are not and have not ever been really in a relationship. And it can also be people who used to be involved, who used to be married or dating at one point. This includes crimes against a person, property, or animal. So oftentimes abusers will use animals as either leverage or as a way to intimidate the person that they are abusing. And it's used as a method of coercion, control, revenge, or punishment. Different jurisdictions and organizations have slightly different legal definitions. So just for reference, the Gunnison Sheriff's Office defines it as infliction or threat of infliction of any bodily injury or harmful physical contact or the destruction of property or threat thereof or the invasion of the home or property or threat thereof as a method of coercion, control, revenge, or punishment upon a person with whom the actor is involved in an intimate relationship. So basically the same thing, but just says it a little bit different. The Judicial Subcommittee of the American Bar Association Commission on Domestic Violence. Definition is domestic violence is learned behavior through observation, experience, reinforcement, culture, family, or community, and is rarely caused by substance abuse, genetics, stress, illness, or other problems in the relationship, although these factors are often used as excuses and can exacerbate violent behavior. Many batterers believe they have the right to make and enforce rules, and many victims routinely evaluate and decide which rules they will follow depending on a variety of factors, such as the danger presented, the available intervention, and the likelihood of punishment by the perpetrator. So this definition goes a little bit deeper into sort of the motivations behind it and the sort of context rather than just like a strict legal definition. It's important to understand, like I said, that family violence in the intimate partner context is the only category of violent crime in which the perpetrator voluntarily remains on the scene, expecting no negative consequences for his behavior and perceiving interventions as a violation of their rights. So, you often, law enforcement will get a domestic violence call and the perpetrator will still be on the scene and will be sort of belligerent about having the police called on them. This wouldn't happen with most other crimes. Most people wouldn't rob a house, burgle a house, and then wait around for the police to show up and then be mad that the police were called on them. And often, by the time law enforcement becomes involved, that's probably not the first time that there's been physical violence. It's probably occurred several times before. So then we're going to go through some definitions rather briefly of charges relating to domestic violence that we have in Colorado. So CRS stands for Colorado Revised Statutes, so those are our state laws. So we have first-degree assault, which is causing bodily harm with a deadly weapon, basically. There's second-degree assault, that is intentionally causing unconsciousness or other physical or mental impairment or injury by administering, without that person's consent, a drug or substance that is capable of producing harm. Third degree is when a person knowingly or recklessly causes bodily injury to another person. Menacing is another charge. That's threat or physical action that places or attempts to place another person in fear of imminent serious bodily injury. This can be done by use of a weapon or verbal threats or making someone believe that they are armed with a weapon. Reckless endangerment is when a person recklessly engages in conduct that creates a substantial risk of bodily injury to another person. People can be charged with violating a restraining order. So this is when a person contacts, harasses, injures, intimidates, molests, threatens, or touches a protected person or protected property, which includes animals, or enters or remains on premises within a specified distance of the protected person or property, or hires or employs another person to locate the protected person, um, and can include possessing or attempting to purchase a firearm or ammunition during while the protection order is in effect. They can be charged for doing that. Disorderly conduct is making coarse or offensive utterances, gestures, or displays in a public place. Harassment is striking, shoving, or kicking, or otherwise touching a person, or directing obscene language or gestures at another person, or following a person in public places. And then there is criminal mischief, which is when person damages property of another person. That I think usually there's like a limit of the value of the property that's damaged that causes it to just be criminal mischief. If it's more, then it can be a class 3 or 4 felony if it's worth like several thousands of dollars. And then, in addition to if a person is charged and sentenced for any of the crimes that I just mentioned, if a court finds that the sort of underlying cause or context of those specific crimes is as part of a domestic violence situation, they can add sort of additional sentencing on to the sentences that are associated with the crimes that I mentioned. They can be ordered to complete like a treatment program or something like that. So the interesting thing here is you may have noticed that I didn't actually list a criminal charge that was, domestic violence. And so there isn't one. You can't be charged with the crime of domestic violence. You can be charged with a form of assault or violating a restraining order or harassing someone. And then, like I said, there could be additional sentencing if it's found to be within the context of domestic violence, but there isn't an actual charge for domestic violence itself. That was the sentencing that I talked about. That can be added on to other sentences with an additional treatment program. So this is another section of the Colorado Revised Statutes on domestic violence that is basically saying that they recognize that domestic violence can be cyclical in nature and can involve patterns of abuse that escalate over time, and that this knowledge can be helpful in prosecuting crimes involving domestic violence. And the evidence of these prior relationships or prior domestic violence related crimes can be admitted as evidence in the prosecution of a new crime. And then it goes on to say the court can determine if this can be applicable to a new case, basically. And can decide whether or not a jury should take it into account. So this is somewhat unique because usually evidence of prior crimes can't be admitted in the prosecution of a current crime. But the law is just saying that it understands that because of the nature of domestic violence and how it can evolve and escalate over time, that they can allow evidence of previous crimes into the prosecution of a current one because it informs the situation in a greater context. And then Colorado has the primary aggressor law that comes into play if a law enforcement officer receives complaints from 2 or more opposing persons. The complaints should be evaluated separately. to see if crimes have been committed by one or both parties. And to do this, they should take into account prior complaints of domestic violence, severity of injury, the potential likelihood of future injury to each person, and possibility that one of the persons may have acted in self-defense. So then we sort of have an issue of if there are female defendants. There are instances where it may appear that a woman is a perpetrator of domestic violence. She might be angry or portraying an intense level of emotion directed at the abuser, while the person doing the abuse, the perpetrator of the abuse, may appear to be very calm and deny that this happened, or blame it on the victim, or minimize the incident. Say it wasn't. She's making it sound way worse than it was, or whatever. Which may, again, make it more appear that the woman is the aggressor. And then the female may also minimize the situation if she's afraid for her own safety once the police leave. However, just because one person is angry and the other person isn't doesn't mean that the angry person is the perpetrator of violence. And also, if both people appear to have injuries, it is possible that the woman acted in self-defense. And so while the male may have injuries, they are probably less severe than injuries that the woman may have. And then there are other situations where it may be a mutual combatant situation where both parties are sort of equally perpetrating violence on each other. And in these cases, there's usually more equal balance of injury, and there's not as much of a presence of a threat to or by either party. There are situations where the woman is the primary aggressor. This often happens when she has been threatened previously with murder or serious injury, and while it's not self-defense in the moment, it's sort of is self-defense in the sense of sort of trying to preempt that serious injury that she's been threatened with. But again, there are also situations where it is just female perpetrated domestic violence, and there's not it's not because of self-defense or threat of safety or anything like that. It's just that the woman is the abuser. Men in this situation are less likely to report or even consider the violence a crime, but they are more likely to leave the situations sooner than women are when the women are the victims. However, that being said, it is much less typical for women to use violence to obtain a desired result or establish authority over an extended period of time, or to control an immediate conflict situation. So while it does happen, it's not it's not nearly as common.
Okay, so we are going to talk about the power and control wheel. It's sort of the basis for a lot of definitions of different types of abuse in domestic violence situations. So we're just going to sort of go around the wheel and talk about everything that's contained in there. So starting at the top, we have intimidation, which is when the abuser uses attitudes and behaviors to invoke fear of harm. And the abuser gains power over the victim and is able to manipulate them to get them to do what they want. But the victim is never really able to meet the demands because the abuser constantly changes them or does something to rationalize that it's not good enough. So this might be doing things like breaking things, abusing pets, displaying weapons, not using them necessarily, but sort of letting the victim know that they're there and could be used if they wanted to. Making threatening comments or other actions. The next one down is emotional abuse. So this is any type of verbal abuse that can be anything from criticism to it can be fairly subtle by just sort of wearing down someone's self-esteem, confidence, self-worth, or sense of identity. So calling someone names, playing mind games, making humiliating comments, making someone feel guilty or bad about themselves, making them think that they're crazy or overreacting to the situation. All of those kinds of things are emotional abuse. The next one is isolation. So this is when the abuser restricts the victim's movements and maintains control over the victim. And this ends up with the abuser getting all of your attention and keeps the victim from getting any outside information that contradicts what the abuser is telling you. So it can be really hard for them to sort of see from outside to get a different perspective on what's happening. So again, this is controlling what the victim does, who they see and talk to, what they read, where they go, limiting contact with people outside of the house, and often the justification is jealousy of them spending time or doing things with other people, that kind of thing. The next one is the minimization, denial, and blaming. So this type of abuse is when the abuser takes no responsibility for their behavior and actions. Their responsibility, they instead project it onto the victim, and then when the victim is, tries to make comment or says something about what's happening, the abuser just sort of minimizes what they're saying. They don't think they've done any wrong, and blames the victim basically for any problems that are arising. So it's, not taking them seriously, sort of brushing off any allegations of abuse, saying it didn't happen, and again, putting the blame on the victim instead. The next one there is using children. So this is when if there's children involved, the abuser can use them to control the partner, the victim, and they're viewed as objects that sort of belong to the abuser. The abuser's needs are more important than the children, and they don't really have a lot of concern or empathy shown for the impact that their behaviors will have on the children. So this can be using the children to relay messages, making the victim feel guilty about, anything relating to the kids. This can also be related to threats of custody issues as well. The next one is male privilege. So this is just sort of the general idea in a relationship that the man is more important, superior. They should make all the decisions, and they know what's best, and they have all the answers, and pretty much the buck stops with them and doesn't allow the female, the victim, to have any kind of say-so on what's happening. So that, being the master of the castle and sort of treating the woman more as like a servant rather than an equal partner, is asserted through various control tactics and can escalate into more severe coercion if it doesn't go the way that they want. The next one is economic or financial abuse. So this is when the abuser purposefully creates financial dependence of the victim on the abuser, which prevents the victim from being able to care for themselves or their children. The abuser may prevent the victim from having a job or receiving higher education to get a better job, or allowing them access to money. They may be on an allowance and not really have any clue as to what their financial situation is or how to access their finances. Then the last one there, up at the top, is threats and coercion. So this is similar to the intimidation, but a little bit more serious. Um, so again, the abuser is trying to force the victim into doing what they want. But if the victim doesn't go along with it, they may make threats to hurt her, um, threats to hurt themselves, or to leave, or report, to welfare or for child custody, and just generally forcing the victim to do things that they don't want to by threatening them with various things, whether it's physical violence or some kind of legal ramification. And then there's a couple other things that are there's the things that are around the wheel, and then something that's not really contained in the wheel currently is spiritual abuse, which is when the abuser prevents victims from either practicing their religion or beliefs of choice or forces them to practice something that they don't believe in. And then going around the wheel there, we have physical abuse, which is any act carried out with the intention of causing physical injury to another person. Then we have sexual abuse, which is when an abuser feels they have an entitlement or a right to be physically sexual with their partner, however and whenever they feel like it. And then there is non-physical sexual abuse, which is when the abuser attempts to control victim's sexuality. So this isn't it's different than the physical sexual abuse, because it's more control over like the way someone dresses or their general appearance, different sexual responses that they have. That it can also include things like unwanted touching or showing interest in other people or having affairs. Those kinds of things all can fall under the sexual abuse category. Other things in physical abuse that are sort of maybe not thought of as often, that is not as straightforward as hitting someone or shoving someone or something like that. Other things that count as physical abuse are things like locking someone out of the house, or leaving them somewhere that's dangerous, or forcing them to be in the car while someone is driving recklessly. All of those things also count as physical abuse, that they just aren't thought of quite as much.
So then we're going to talk about the cycle of violence, which is displayed here. There's generally thought to be 3 stages: the tension building, the acute or explosion stage, and the honeymoon or hearts and flowers stage. So in the tension building stage, this sometimes can last for a really long time. So this is when the victim sort of is walking on eggshells around the abuser because they're not quite sure what might make them blow up about something. So they're trying to anticipate the abuser's moods and judge, what kind of mood that they're in, so that they know what kind of behaviors may be safer for the victim to do at that time. Or they might just try and stay out of the way. And the abuser is often sort of simmering, is kind of what I think of. They're not exploding yet, but they're sort of frustrated or irritated easily, and just sort of the general mood is like constant tension. This can sometimes last for a very long time. The longer the abuse goes on, probably the shorter it's going to shorten over time. As this sort of the cycle not only goes around and around, but also sort of ratchets up. It sort of increases in its baseline of severity. During this time, the victim is likely to sort of try and deny the reality of the situation, and makes excuses for any sort of small blow-ups that may happen, some minor incidents, or for their behavior that they're doing in sort of anticipation of how the abuser is acting. They may make excuses for both of those things at this time. So this is going to go on for, potentially a while, but then eventually the tension is going to build to the point where the abuser is going to explode and have an acute incident of some kind. They can no longer control their anger and tension, and so they're going to let it out on the victim. It's very unpredictable. You never know when that final straw is going to come that's going to break and cause this to happen. It's usually unrelated to the victim's behavior, but often will be blamed on the victim anyway. So then the victim is left feeling like it's their fault that they were beaten or whatever because they, didn't get dinner on the table at the right time or something like that. Even though that's not an excuse to hit someone at all, but that's the way that the abuser will frame it. So this is when the violence is at its most severe, is in this explosion or acute incident phase. The victim may side with the abuser at this point, and if there's law enforcement involved, they may not cooperate, they may deny what's happening or minimize it, and kind of protect the abuser. And often the victim will just sort of have the approach of trying to wait out the storm or try and fix it, again, like it's their responsibility to make things better. And then after this acute violent stage, they're going to cycle back around to the honeymoon phase or the hearts and flowers phase, where the abuser, apologizes and shows guilt and remorse for having hurt the victim, and they express, to please don't leave me, and they express that they're afraid of being abandoned, and this is when often, they'll really work on the victim's guilt about things. It's not unusual for an abuser who maybe had a tough childhood or something to pull that out and sort of blame it on that and, say you're the only one that I feel safe around that understands, and it's not my fault because this happened to me when I was younger, or things like that, and really play on those emotional strings of the victim. And because, oftentimes the victim loves the abuser and they want to think things will get better, so they accept these things from the abuser. And the abuser manipulates the victim into thinking that, that's the last time it'll happen, and they're really sorry. They may literally bring, flowers or other gifts to apologize. The thing to note here, though, however, is that again, with the longer someone stays in an abusive relationship, the shorter the tension building is going to get, and the honeymoon phase may disappear, and they may just sort of go back and forth between the eggshells, walking on the eggshells, and then the actual violence. So the honeymoon phase may slowly disappear or get shorter or get less, apologetic over time as that general cycle escalates. We like to highlight a specific form of abuse, physical abuse in violent situations, which is strangulation. This particular form of violence is one of the sort of largest indicators of a potential lethal situation in the future. If a abuser strangles a victim and even if that particular instance doesn't kill the victim, that's a pretty good indication that the situation could become lethal down the road. um, it's one of the most dangerous forms of abuse, and it doesn't take very much time to incapacitate or kill someone via strangulation, or cause major internal damage. Um, and there's sort of in fighting hand-to-hand combat techniques, the concept of control the head equals control of the body is, I mean, sort of a basic key tenet of hand-to-hand combat. So if you have someone strangling you, there's very little that the rest of your body is going to be able to do to fight back, especially if the person is bigger than you. So it's also part of why the strangulation is so dangerous is it's very common to never see any external visible injuries after someone is strangled. Um, so often people think that they're okay because they can't see anything from the outside. But it is really important to seek medical attention after a strangulation incident, especially if there's any soreness or your voice is affected, as those can be symptoms of a more serious internal injury. There's a lot of delicate anatomy in the neck of humans, and there's a lot of blood vessels that can be damaged, some very fragile bones and cartilage in the spine, and throat area in general, like your esophagus and voice box and all that, that can be damaged that, again, you can't see from the outside, but may be damaged on the inside. So it's really important if we ever have any clients that have experienced strangulation to make sure that they get medical attention to make sure that they're okay. So next we're going to watch this video called Crazy Love. It's a TED Talk. It's a little over 15 minutes long, that addresses, well, it talks about this woman who was in an abusive relationship, and she talks about her experience and why she stayed with her abuser for as long as she did, which is a question that a lot of people ask is, why do victims stay with their abusers? So it's a really illuminating video. So go ahead. You can pause this video that you're watching right now, and the link to the Crazy Love TED Talk will be below. You can click on that and go ahead and watch that now. Okay, so now that you have watched that video, we're doing the in-person training, we have a sort of discussion about some things that come up after watching it. But just think for yourself if there is anything about her story that was surprising to you or unusual in some way based on sort of your ideas about domestic violence situations. Think about why you think she stayed for as long as she did. If someone like Leslie, who gave the talk, came in to Project Hope or a similar organization for services during the abuse, what might be some areas that would be of particular concern to you that you might want to really make sure you talk to that person about? Do you think that socioeconomic status impacts the way a victim might process abuse? Um, and if you do think that that impacts it, explain some of those differences that you think there might be. Someone who maybe only has a high school diploma versus someone like Leslie who has been through a fair amount of higher education. Just sort of think about those things for yourself. Just kind of have an internal discussion with yourself about those things. If you have other comments or questions about that video that you would like to discuss with staff in person, then please feel free to note those down and we can talk about that in person at a later time. But building off of the why do they stay question, this is something that everybody I feel like probably asks at some point when they hear about a domestic violence situation. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she get out? And there are a lot of reasons. That we will talk about now. So maybe as far as frequency and severity of the abuse goes, if several incidents happen over a short period of time and then there's a long period of time where nothing happens, they might be able to convince themselves that it was a one-time thing and it's not going to happen again, or it's maybe happened a few times, but it hasn't happened in a really long time, so it probably won't happen again. Or they might think that it's not that bad. They maybe think that in the spectrum of domestic violence, that being grabbed by the arm isn't really a big deal. At least he doesn't hit me or something like that. That they might think that it's not that big of a deal. If in their childhood they grew up in a situation where they had an abusive parent, either to their partner or spouse, or they experienced abuse as a child from a parent, or experienced incest or anything like that, they may just sort of assume that that's the norm and not be aware that that is not the norm and that they don't need to be in a relationship like that. As we talked about before, they may be under economic abuse situation where they don't have their own money. They don't have any skills to get a job. They might not really even have access to their bank accounts or documents that they may need to be able to live on their own. And if you don't have those things, like I said, it can be, you can be really limited in your ability to leave that situation. They might be very afraid of if they leave that the abuser will come find them, and that the abuse will get worse once they're found, or if they tell anyone, the abuser will find out and the abuse will be worse. They may be afraid of relating to the economic part of it. They may be afraid of how they're going to live if they don't have the financial support of the abuser, and they may be afraid of reactions from family and friends. Unfortunately, reactions are not always supportive of the victim, so they may not want to, they may be afraid of having to deal with that. Many, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but a lot of people who are killed as a result of domestic violence, it happens after they've left. So leaving can be really scary because oftentimes that just really escalates things to a point of extreme violence very quickly, and they have very real reason to be afraid of leaving and it making it worse if they can't get all the way away. So another reason why they might stay is that they may be very isolated with no support system. They maybe have been cut off from friends and family for an extended period of time, where they don't feel like they can go to them, or maybe they didn't really have that to begin with, and that's sort of maybe why they ended up in the situation that they are partially. Um, so either way, victims often don't really have a support system outside of their abuser. They may not be aware that there are organizations like ours that can provide support and services. They may be facing threats to children for seeking help, and they're too isolated to be able to do anything about it. They may not be aware of the cycle of violence, and without that sort of awareness, you may not really understand that your situation is not good. And they may have personal beliefs about about marriage and divorce, or parenting children, that prevents them from feeling like they can leave a situation. Oftentimes, victims struggle with low self-esteem that may have been in place before abuse started, or may be a result of the abuse, or both. Maybe it got worse. But so they may be often depressed, feel like they deserve the treatment that they get from their abuser. They may experience the phenomenon of learned helplessness, where nothing that they've been able to do has helped their situation anyway, so they've basically sort of given up on anything being able to help them. They may feel guilty for being in the situation that they're in, and ashamed due to social stigma that we still have attached to domestic violence victims. Again, a little bit more about the beliefs about marriage and the partner. These may be a result of religious, cultural, or societal sort of norms. They may believe that children, if there's children, they need two parents, and so they shouldn't leave because of that. Or they may believe, because of the way they were raised, that abuse is part of marriage and relationships, and that they may believe that it's the woman's responsibility for sort of making things work, and sort of capitulating to the male partner. And often victims, love their partner. They may be emotionally dependent on them, or think that the abuser is all powerful, so they may be, afraid to leave because they're like, he'll find me, and he knows, he's gonna know, and so they're just afraid to make any kind of a move because they think that they have this sort of like all-knowing abilities. And often, like I said, abusers will play on the emotions of the victim, making them pity them and feel compassion for difficulties that they may have had, either currently or earlier in their life, that that they use as excuses for the violence that they inflict on their partner. So we are gonna watch two videos of part 1 and part 2 of the Love the Way You Lie song by Rihanna and Eminem. So you can watch them back to back. There's links below for part 1 and part 2 of Love the Way You Lie. So you can pause this video and then go ahead and watch both of them. I think together it's maybe about 9 or 10 minutes for both of them. So go ahead and pause here, and then watch the two of those, and then come back to this video. Okay. So now that we've watched both of those, so part one is sort of the perspective from the male perspective, and part two is supposed to be sort of from the female perspective of the same situation. So just some, again, this is something that we would normally have a discussion about, but some things for you to just think about. When these videos came out, some people, songs and videos came out, said that the video and lyrics glorified domestic violence. Do you agree or disagree with that opinion? You know, and then building off of that, what role do you think pop culture has in defining social norms? If any, maybe you don't think that it has a role, but what role do you think, if any, that it does play in defining social norms? And just any other takeaways from this video. Sort of think about, I know the one video is just a lyric video, but in the first one, what do we see as far as the cycle of violence? That you can kind of see that I think at some point the guy brings a teddy bear maybe, or flowers or something. So you can kind of see that the abuse and then the honeymoon phase played out in that video. So just some things to think about.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some different risk factors that a victim of domestic violence may face, sort of in following up on the why do they stay kind of idea that we were talking about a couple slides ago. So we have this chart that sort of gives some examples of potential risks of staying in an abusive relationship and potential risks of leaving the relationship. And you may notice that a lot of them are the same, whether it's staying or leaving. A lot of the risk factors are the same. And it's important to note that while physical violence is definitely a huge risk, it's not the only one that they may face, whether they're trying to leave or not. And it may not be considered the most severe to that particular victim. They may have things that they're more concerned about. As you can see, leaving a relationship by no means guarantees the reduction or elimination of risk, and in some cases, it can actually make it more dangerous. So that's something to consider if we're talking to clients about leaving a relationship, letting them know that doesn't make the threat go away, and also understanding their reasons for not wanting to leave as well. We often focus on trying to remove the victim from a violent situation for obvious reasons. Our initial gut reaction is if someone is in physical danger to do what we can to try and remove them from that danger. But it's just important to know that maybe isn't the best thing and may not be that effective. So what we want to do is just let the client know all the information that we have about these different risks and their different options and choices that they can make to try and keep themselves as safe as they can while making, progress towards improving their situation. It's important that each client that we talk to is approached as an individual with different risks, options, and resources. So this is going to be different for everybody. Even if someone has the exact same type of risk, they may prioritize them differently. Someone may be more concerned about suicide risk, and someone may be more concerned about child custody issues. So it really depends on each one of our clients, their particular situation, and what they want to do. So that's just something that we want to keep in mind while we are working with them. The one thing I would like to highlight a little bit on here is that custody issue. So while for us as advocates, it may seem like it makes more sense for an abuser to not be someone that could have custody of children because we know that they probably shouldn't. But in reality, it's a little bit the opposite. 25 to 50% of disputed custody cases involve a domestic violence situation. So a significant number of all child custody issues are having a domestic violence situation happen in that relationship. Importantly, abusive parents are more likely to seek sole custody of the children than non-violent ones. So they're much more likely, a parent that's seeking sole custody is more likely to be an abusive parent than not. And alarmingly, they are successful of getting that sole custody about 70% of the time. So again, having a client who is afraid of losing custody of their children if they leave a relationship is a very real concern. Just because we think that that is wrong doesn't mean that it won't happen. So we definitely don't want to discount that concern of a parent. Abusers use their children as a means to intimidate and control the victim, and this only increases when the victim leaves because now the victim is no longer in the house under their control. So they're going to increase, try and maximize their control over the means that they have left, which is the children. So it's just going to make it worse as they try to use the tools that they still have available to them when that person is out of the house. Another thing to keep in mind for victims who are going to court to deal with child custody issue is that these victims are often not in the best state of mind. They may be depressed or have PTSD or just like completely stressed out about what's happening, which may lead to them not presenting as best as they can in court. So they may not look as together of a parent as they would like to and as they are because they are so overwhelmed with what's happening. And they also often don't have great legal counsel. They don't have the resources or the means to retain really good legal counsel for themselves. And so, again, are sort of at a disadvantage for being able to fight to keep their kids if they're not doing well and if they don't have access to that good legal representation. So that's just something I want to highlight because it's sort of a very special and specific issue that some of our clients may face.
So we are going to move on to talking about stalking for the last part of this training because it's sort of a special case of violence that happens. So stalking behaviors are a significant indicator of escalating violence and the need for control over the victim. For us here at Project Hope, if there are any stalking concerns present for a client, no matter how serious it seems, we have to have a written safety plan for that client. That's a requirement for us. So in order to do this, we need to do an in-depth risk assessment so that we can really make sure that the safety plan covers all situations. We don't want any gaps or shortcomings in the safety plan for the person who's being stalked. It's also imperative that we talk to our clients about the use of technology and social media in stalking today. It's so easy for people to find out where people are based on their social media or using like tracker apps on phones, that it's really important that we talk about all those things and the dangers that can come with like using social media. It can make it just really easy for a stalker to keep track of a victim without them even knowing it. So that is something that absolutely needs to be discussed with our stalking clients. So this is the definition of stalking under the state revised statutes. This is a relatively new form of this law. It was changed in 2010. The definition of stalking used to be included within a definition of harassment, but it's now been given its own separate section outside of the harassment section to acknowledge the severity of stalking and the need for unique and appropriate interventions and penalties for stalking rather than just placing it under the umbrella of harassment. So go ahead and take a few minutes to read through the definition that's here on this slide. Okay, so now that you read through that, I just want to touch real quick on the penalties associated with stalking. With this new law, the penalty for stalking can be a class 4 or 5 felony, whereas the old definition under the harassment statute carried a penalty of a class 1 or 3 misdemeanor. So they really upped the penalties. A felony is a much bigger deal than a misdemeanor. So it's good that the state has recognized that stalking is not just some harmless behavior, but that it can actually be really dangerous and a pretty big deal. So there are a few different types of stalkers. However, in general, regardless of the type, the less of an actual relationship that there was between the victim and the stalker, the more mentally disturbed a stalker is likely to be, if that makes sense. So in intimate partner stalkers, go ahead, there's a video that's sort of related to all three of these types. So we'll click the video and then I'll talk a little bit more about them for each of the three. So for now, go ahead and pause my recording here and you can click the link below for intimate partner stalkers and watch that short video, and then we'll talk more about them. Okay. So generally speaking, intimate partner stalkers, about half of all stalkers fall into this category. They're often sort of known as the guy who can't let go of a relationship that he was in. They sort of refuse to believe that the relationship is over. Often people, including the victim of the stalking, feel bad or sorry for them because they're just seem sort of like sad and lonely or whatever. However, research has shown that these stalkers are not sympathetic, lonely people who are still hopelessly in love, but they are actually more likely to be emotionally abusive and controlling during their relationship with the victim. So often in these cases, victims may accidentally encourage the stalker by trying to let them down easy or talking to them just one more time or that kind of thing. But it's important for a victim of stalking to just say no once and then ignore the stalker as best they can so that they're not sort of continuing that communication in any way. So next up is delusional stalkers. And so again, go ahead and pause this recording and click the link below for delusional stalkers and watch that real quick. Okay, so this type of stalker usually has little or no contact with their victim. They may have significant mental illness issues, and they may have something called erotomania. And so the stalkers with erotomania have a delusional belief that the victim loves them or is destined to be with the stalker. And they have some kind of false belief that ties them to the victim. These stalkers are usually unmarried and socially immature loners. They're often unable to establish or sustain close relationships with others and have had few, if any, personal sexual experiences. They usually come from backgrounds that were emotionally barren or severely abusive, and they often have a poor sense of identity, which leads them to strive for satisfaction through another. Usually someone who's perceived to be of higher status in some way. So that usually means that they're unattainable to them in actuality. People who work in helping professions are particularly vulnerable to attracting this type of stalker. And studies suggest that this type of the stalker is the most tenacious. People who have erotomania delusions can last on average of 10 years. And they can rationalize a victim's behavior in many ways, so it's essential for the victim to not have any contact with the stalker, because if they do, the stalker is going to take it and rationalize it in a way that makes sense in their delusion, which will just sort of prolong the situation. So the last type of stalker is vengeful stalkers. So again, go ahead and pause this video and click on the link for vengeful stalkers below and watch that. Okay, so this type of stalker usually is angry at their victim over some slight that can be real or imagined. They may be really happened, or they're maybe making it up or exaggerating in their minds. Politicians and or celebrities often get this type of stalker. Also, disgruntled former employees can fit into this category. These type of stalkers may be psychopathic without conscience or remorse, and may be delusional and are often paranoid and often view themselves as the victim and are stalking as a means to get even with the person that they're mad at. So these are some examples of stalking behaviors. You can just sort of take a minute to look at them and just kind of take note of the variety of types of behaviors that there are that can fall under stalking. It doesn't have to be sort of your typical thing. They're just like following them around kind of thing. They may harass your friends and family instead of you directly, or try and sort of tarnish your reputation by spreading information about you to your coworkers or family or friends or whatever. So it's not all sort of directly following someone or trying to monitor their phone or their social media or whatever. So stalking has a lot of common traits that it shares with domestic violence. So people who perpetrate domestic violence often have similar characteristics to those who stalk people. Stalking has its own cycle of behaviors, and it's fairly similar to behaviors exhibited in the domestic violence cycle of violence. So they can also sort of go through that like increase in activity, or maybe they show themselves a little bit more to the person that they're stalking, and then they maybe will cycle away and be more distant and kind of go through that cycle as well. In the attention building phase, the stalker may move from relatively small invasions of privacy to more dangerous ones. During the explosive stage, they may actually, attack their stalking victim in some way. And then in the honeymoon or hearts and flowers phase, the stalker switches techniques and may appear to back off, which might lead the victim to let down their guard. And sometimes this phase is in between the tension and explosive stage rather than after the explosive stage for stalking. So here are some stalking statistics. So you can take a minute to look through those. So I just want to highlight the last statistic about victims reporting some kind of cyber stalking. In today's world, cyber stalking has become more common than physical stalking. A few points about that. 40% of cyber stalking victims are men. And this is much more likely to be perpetrated by a stranger, which makes sense. It's way easy to sort of find somebody online and then become kind of obsessed with them and follow them on social media. It's much easier to do that, and safer for the stalker as far as getting caught, because it's much harder to track that kind of thing down. However, almost a quarter of cyber stalking perpetrators is still done by former partners of someone. So that's still a significant amount are still people who are known to the victim. 20% Victims said that their stalker came from social networking sites, and sort of the breakdown of where cyberstalking happens. 30% is through email, 30% is through Facebook, 3% is via Twitter, and 1% is over YouTube. And while 40% of stalking victims are men, the majority of victims still are women between the ages of 18 and 29. So the last little bit here is talking about safety strategies for stalking. So there's a fair number of security precautions that someone who's being stalked can take. So it's recommended that you block your address and don't give it out. And you can have your address blocked at the DMV or through voter registration. So then you can get a PO box or look into the address confidentiality program that we can facilitate through Project Hope. Don't give out your phone number. If your stalker already has your phone number, don't change it, and make sure that the voicemail is set up, but then get a new number that you only provide to the few people that you trust with it, so that a record can be kept of that stalker calling you and leaving voicemails, and that there will take them longer to be aware that you're not using that phone anymore. But then also, you still have a phone, and it's important for you to keep a phone with you at all times. So in case you need to call for help, you can do that as well. It's really important to document everything that happens. So if you are getting text messages or whatever, if you can take screenshots of them. If you get letters or gifts or anything like that, keep it and log it. If you are just see your stalker around, make sure you keep a log of any sightings or interactions that you have with them, that you can't log in another way, like phone calls. You can take a self-defense class. The emphasis here is to become more aware of surroundings, and maybe feel empowered, but it's not to say that just because you've been through the training means you won't be a victim. So just sort of be aware of that. Destroy any discarded mail, so you don't just throw it out, because as we saw a few slides ago, going through the trash is something that stalkers may do. So you don't want them to be able to get their hands on any personal information. So if you are going to throw away an email, you might want to shred it first or something like that. And don't be afraid to draw attention to yourself if you are in a situation that you feel unsafe. If you're being followed or something like that, don't be embarrassed to make a scene or to go to a friend's house or neighbors, or tell them what's happening. The more people that are aware and can help watch and help keep you safe, the better. So then another specific precaution you can take is protection orders. This is often suggested to people who are being stalked, but it can't keep them from stalking you. The stalking can still occur. It's just a piece of paper, essentially. It can actually make things worse. It's important to understand how protection orders are enforced. Where you live, it's different depending on jurisdiction and what the penalties are for violating it. If the penalties aren't very big or very severe, then they're probably going to risk it and aren't going to pay any attention to the order anyway. Also, when you fill out a restraining order, it asks for the person placing the order, it asks for their address. You can choose not to put it, but if you didn't know that that's optional, if you put it, then the stalker gets a copy, and then now they have your address. Maybe they didn't have it before. Or it just sort of notifies them, because they have to be told about it. It lets them know that you are putting this out there, and it can make them, angry or escalate things in a way that wouldn't So there's no way to really tell which stalkers may become violent and harm their victim. Sometimes, excuse me, sometimes the most harmless cases can turn out to be the deadliest. Excuse me. It's important to note, like I mentioned earlier, that those who are associated with the victim may also be in danger. So the stalker may choose to act out any violence not on the victim but on those that the victim knows. If a victim feels that they are in imminent danger, their primary goal should be to find a safe place and call for help if it's that imminent. Call the police or something. For victims where it doesn't seem like there's any immediate risk, it's still really important to make that safety plan and to help talk through, preventative measures to try and minimize the risk. But that safety plan is there to minimize the risk, but also to be in place in case things escalate as well. So that's why it's really important that we have that safety plan in place for our stalking victims. And with that, that is the end of Domestic Violence 101. If you have any questions that had come up throughout the whole training session, please make note of them, or if you have just comments or anything like that, please make note of them so that we can address them by staff in person. And otherwise, I hope that you learned some things about domestic violence and stalking.